Hey, welcome back. So we have this enum for session states, and we need to implement each state for our game. Now the first one we're going to deal with is the warm-up state. We'd like to update the warm-up timer, and we're going to use the tick function for this. And we'd also like our player input disabled so we can't move while we're in the warm-up state. We're going to have a 3, 2, 1 timer letting us know when we can start moving and shooting drones. Now after the warm-up time is finished, we can set the session state to in progress, and then the player will know that they can start playing the game. So let's get started. All right, so I'm going to go back into our game mode here. And in event tick, we're switching on session state and we're calling update warm-up timer each frame. We need to update that warm-up timer. So let's go into this function. And so far, we're only setting the text to 0. Well, we need to know how much time has passed, and we should also have a variable for our warm-up time. So let's add a new variable, and we'll call this warm-up time. This will be the number of seconds that will be in the warm-up state, and we can make this a float. Now I'm going to compile and set the warm-up time to 3 seconds by default. So we need to think about how we can update this warm-up text. We know we're starting the game in the warm-up state, and we want to know how much time has passed since the game started. And we can get that with a nice handy function called getGameTime in seconds. This returns how much time has passed. In fact, if we'd like to see that time, we can set the text to the game time. By dragging it in, we'll get a toText node, and if we hit play, look at that. We see how much time has passed. It's counting up. So we can use this value. Now we want to know how much time is left, which means we're going to take our warm-up time, which is 3 seconds, and we're going to subtract the game time from that. So let's do a subtract node. And what we get here is the amount of time left. So let's plug that in and see what that looks like. So it's counting down from 3 to 1 and 0, and then of course it continues counting down into the negative values. So we're almost there, but that's not quite what we want. For one, we're seeing all the decimals to the right of the decimal point, and we'd really like to just show an integer. So rather than just converting this to text, let's round this up to the nearest integer. There's a nice handy math node for that. It's called ceil to int. It's actually ceil to int 64. 64 meaning it's a 64-bit integer. Regular integers are typically 32 bits, and a 64-bit integer is just larger and capable of storing more digits. This should work fine for us, so let's go ahead and hook that up to in text, and notice we get a different toText node. We don't need toText converting a float to a text. We can delete that. We need toText from an int64. So if we compile this and hit play, now we see that it starts at 3, goes down, and of course continues counting down. So we're closer. The only thing left to do is to transition out of the warm-up state and into the in-progress state once this value reaches 0. Now we can use a branch for this, so I'm going to hold B and create a branch, and for our condition, we can check this value after rounding up to the nearest integer and seeing if it's less than or equal to 0. And we can hook that up to the branch. Now, as soon as this value is less than or equal to 0, we can do something here. So we'll take care of this shortly, but before we do so, I'd like to do some other things when we start the game in the warm-up state. Let's go back to the event graph. So from here in begin play, I'm going to disable player input. And I'm going to create a function to do this. So I'm going to add a new function, and I'm going to call this disable player input. Now we need to get the player. So we can right-click and type get player pawn. This will return us the player pawn with player index 0. Now, this is a single-player game. There's only going to be one player, and it's going to be the player with player index 0. Now, this returns a pawn object reference, so we need to cast it to FPS character. So we'll perform this cast here, and we need to disable player input. Now, the reason I'm casting to FPS character is because I'd like to make sure to set fire button pressed to false. So let's drag off of this and type fire button pressed and use a setter for this and make sure we're setting this to false. That way we definitely won't be firing the weapon. And after that, we can disable player input, and we can do that directly from the pawn data type. So let's drag off of that and type disable input. And this function will ensure that we cannot add player input. Even if we're pressing keys and moving the mouse, we will not be moving the character. So we have this function disable player input. I'm going to go back to the event graph, and here in begin play, I'm going to drag off and call disable player input. Now, if I hit play, we're starting off without the ability to move. I'm pressing the mouse buttons, I'm pressing the keyboard keys, and I'm not moving. Okay, perfect. Now, I'm also going to organize begin play with a sequence node so that we're not stringing up too many nodes one by one. So let's drag off, type sequence, and we'll do these things one by one in the sequence node. So first, we'll add the game mode HUD to the viewport. Next, we're setting the number of drones. We'll stick that down here for the then one case. And finally, we're calling disable player input, our newly created custom function. And we'll add a pin to the sequence node and connect that here. And we can even comment this and just say disable player input for the warm-up. That way we can see it when we zoom out. Okay, so that takes care of the warm-up state, and we're updating the warm-up timer, and as soon as our timer reaches 0, we want to go into the in progress state. So I'd like you to create a function to do this. Create a new function, call it whatever you like, maybe something like start game, and set the session state enum to in progress. In this function, you'll also enable player input. Now, I didn't show you how to do that, but I did show you how to disable player input. So see if you can figure that out on your own. And if not, that's fine. We'll do it together. Now, I'd also like you to remove the warm-up timer text. We can do this by setting the text to an empty string. So pause the video and create this start game function now. All right, so we need a new function. Let's add this function, and we'll call this start game. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is set the session state. So let's get our session state and use a setter here and hook that up, and we'll set the state to in progress. Now, we also want to enable player input. So we can get the player pawn, and you may have guessed that there might be a function called enable input, since we called disable input. And if you typed enable input, you were rewarded with enable input. Now, notice that it takes a player controller. So this was another part of the challenge that you needed to adapt to. So how do we get our player controller? So this might have been a little bit trickier for you. And if you figured it out, congratulations. And if not, that's totally fine. We're going to do it here. Now, you may have discovered that the player pawn object type has a function called getController. And if you tried to hook this up, you were met with frustration because this function enable input requires a player controller object reference, and getController returns a controller object reference. Now, if you decided that you might try taking that controller and casting to a player controller, then you saw that you could hook these up and you could plug in the player controller value for player controller. And if you did this, congratulations, you discovered how to make this work, which is great. The reason that this cast succeeds is because getPlayerPawn is going to return our player pawn in the form of a pawn, but that object is in fact an FPS character, since that's what we have set here in the game mode as the default pawn. and getController will get that pawn's controller, which is in fact a player controller, even though the function getController returns a controller object reference. We can still cast that to a player controller and pass that in. So now we're enabling input, we're setting the session state to in progress. The only thing left to do is to hide that warm-up text. So let's get our game mode HUD. And from the game mode HUD, we're going to get warm-up text. And we're going to use a set text node. So set text, and we can simply leave this blank. We're setting it to an empty text string. So let's compile this, and we now have a function we can call once we've reached 0 seconds in our countdown. And that's going to be here in update warmup timer. We have this branch, and we're ready to do something when this calculation, warmup time minus the game time, is less than or equal to 0. So in that case, we can simply call start game. Let's compile and hit play. Now, I can't move, I'm pressing buttons, but as soon as our countdown timer is over, I can now move around. Input is now enabled, and I can shoot. Excellent. So we now have a warm-up state and a warm-up timer, and we can't move in the warm-up state. But we see that countdown timer suggesting to us that we will be able to move as soon as that timer is over. And we're enabling movement once we go into the in progress state when we call our new function start game. So this is looking great. It's now time to implement the other states. Excellent job. See you soon.